Hello and welcome to this new tutorial. Today we're going to make our first functions in Solidity. So as you can see, these functions will get us the equity in altcoins of an investor. The investor will be the input of the function and the equity in USD of the investor. Alright, so let's do this. Let's make these two functions. To make a function in Solidity, we need to start with function. Then we need to give a name to that function and we'll call it equity in altcoins. And as we just said, this function will take as argument the investor's address, like its public key, which is a unique identifier that allows to differentiate the investors. And to specify a variable as argument of a function in Solidity, well, as for what we did previously, we need to specify the type first, which is an address, and then the name of that variable. And the name of the variable, we have to choose it. It's going to be investor. Alright, so that's pretty clear. We take the address of the investor as input of this equity in altcoins function, but be careful, this is the type and this is the name of the variable. And then before we define what this function has to do, we need to specify the type of what this function returns, which will be of course the equity and therefore an integer. Again, it will be an unsigned integer because the equity is always positive. And besides, we'll add here, you'll see that the address of the investor is an external constant that is a constant, never modified, and that is besides outside of the contract. Because the address of the investor is not proper to the contract. And we'll specify this by adding here external constant. Just like that. External constant, so that's for the address of the investor. And now to specify the type of what this function is going to return, well, we add here returns and then the type in parentheses. And the type, as we said, is a U integer function. So for those of you who want more information or explanation on this external constant, well, I prepared for you here the part of the documentation that contains these explanations. So in contract, in this part of the documentation, you will find constant state variables. So you click on this, and here we go, you have a lot more explanations on these constant state variables. State variables can be declared as constant, and that's what we just did. So great if you can check this out. Now let's go back to Remix, and let's continue our function. So we are done with all the presets of this function, and now to define what this function has to do, be careful, it's not a colon like in Python, it's some brackets. And again, if I press enter, we automatically get the closing bracket. Okay? And now inside this function, we have to code what we want this function to do. And what exactly do we want this function to do? Well, we want this function to give us the equity in altcoins of an investor. We already have the address of the investor, so we're going to take that address and we're going to use, of course, the mapping that we made previously to take the address as argument and returns the equity in altcoins. And that's all we have to do, thanks to this mapping here. But now some of you might wonder, why are we not using the mapping directly instead of making this new function which looks redundant? Well, that's because this function that we're making right now is exactly the tool with which we will interact in MyEtherWallet. You'll see we'll have in the drop-down list of the actions we can do, this function and the other functions we'll make, like buy altcoins or sell altcoins. So that's the main reason we're making this function, just retaking the mapping in order to be able to call this in MyEtherWallet. Okay? So now what we just need to do is therefore to get our mapping, which we called equity altcoins. So I'm copying this, and here I'm going to return exactly this mapping. Return equity altcoins, which of course takes as argument the address of the investor. And therefore, to finish this, we just need to input here investor. Alright, done. And let's not forget the semicolon. There we go, our function is ready. So congratulations for having implemented your first function. Now let's be very efficient and copy this in order to do the same for getting the equity in USD this time of an investor. So I'm pasting that here. And now, no worries, we get a lot of errors, a lot of red, but that's okay. That's just because we have the same functions. We just need to give another name here, which will be, of course, equity in USD. That's a new function which will take as argument the address of the investor. Don't forget that address is a type and investor is the name of the variable. This investor variable is an external constant, and this function will return the equity in US dollars of the investor. And therefore, I'm here replacing @coins by USD, because indeed the name of our mapping the investor address to its equity in USD is called equity USD. And therefore here, let's press enter, and there we go, we have our second function. Perfect, so that's it for this tutorial, quite an easy one. In the next one, it's gonna get slightly more challenging because we'll make eventually our buy @coins function, which will be the action, the tool to buy some @coins in my Ether wallet. And so that's exactly what we have to implement in this next tutorial. And then we'll have a final tutorial to implement the inverse function to sell some @coins, because I remind that we offer to our investors the buyback option.